couldn't prevent was the escalation of frequency of use, another, less notorious sign of addiction.
She graduated from Harvard to heroin. Hard drugs and addiction have an all-new face, and that's fueled the debate over how to fight back. Continue the war on the criminal side, or consider some kind of legalization. A former governor and a former AG square off on this most controversial of questions on this week's edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
Our national prison population, close to 2 million people, thanks in large part to the war on drugs. And though it costs us $50 billion a year, it's a war we're still managing to lose.
So the calls for a major change in drug policy are becoming more common. Witness Gary Johnson, Republican governor of New Mexico, who says it's time to consider legalization.
And he's not alone. Today, here in our studio, we'll hear some similar heresy for the first time from Brendan Byrne, Democrat, former governor of New Jersey, and the argument against decriminalization from Bob Del Tufo, a man who's held both of the top law enforcement jobs in this state.
But as different as their positions may be, both have to face the fact that not only has drug use not gone away, but drugs, even hard drugs like heroin, have found a place among the more suburban, more affluent, from study hall to Wall Street. Meet Ann Marlowe.
Dope made it easier for me to stay at home. Dope was a home, a psychic space that filled the essential functions of the physical construct, providing a predictable comfort and security. Heroin became the place where, when you showed up, they had to let you in.
Ann Marlowe's image of dope as home is a far cry from the home where she grew up.
You know, it was a very sheltered, very white, upper middle class community.
But her book doesn't deal with life in Upper Saddle River.
In high school, there were drugs, definitely, but mainly soft drugs.
Instead, it's the Lower East Side of New York and her years of addiction to heroin.
When I moved to the East Village in the late 80s, I found myself among a lot of people who I gradually became aware were doing heroin. And some of them were really bright, interesting, lively. They weren't people who corresponded to my image of the junkie.
Oh, how do I get in touch with them?
Ann Marlowe and her friends were white and well-heeled, well-educated, and employed. You were able to work?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Make money?
Yeah.
Stay in the mainstream culture?
Yeah. Hi, Steve, this is Ann Marlowe calling. I'm a headhunter for tax and pension lawyers. I've been doing that for the last 13 years.
So you were doing that while you were using heroin?
Oh, yes.
Marlowe went to school at Harvard, but that wasn't where she learned to do dope. And though she never shot the stuff, she says that didn't stop her from becoming addicted.
I got high first thing in the morning. This was the worst because as soon as you got high, it felt like you disappeared the whole day. The opposite of stopping time.
And the experts at rehab centers like this one say that Marlowe is not unique, that heroin's big on Wall Street and in suburban high schools, that the image of the urban junkie with empty pockets and empty life is now just one side of the heroin picture.
As far as in suburbia, it's running pretty rampant. Everybody, like, basically I know has tried it, or, you know, I guarantee everybody knows someone who's tried it.
Well, I think that the Calvin Klein ads, I mean, there's been a glamorous type of atmosphere about the heroin use. And I think that the white middle class, white upper class, when they saw heroin as, let's try this out. Everyone's trying something, make them happy, make them a quick high. And if we do it, snort it, we're not really an addict.
And that was just what Ann Marlowe thought when she decided to try it just once.
Figured, well, I probably won't like it. No one need ever know that I tried it. I'll just try it, I'll get it over with. I'll never have any curiosity about it again.
But doctors say heroin doesn't tend to work that way.
We know a lot about the history of heroin addiction. That is, we have at least 100 years worth of experience with having major difficulties with people who develop heroin addiction and then cannot ever refrain from its use.
Where Dr. Stanley spends her days, the face of heroin is not wealthy and white, but here at Newark's Integrity House, it comes in all colors, classes, and kinds.
It's all over now. And it's evidenced by, I mean, we have my colleague Joe Hannon up in Mendham is seeing a tremendous influx up there of heroin addicts, IV heroin addicts. We're seeing it down here in our urban and suburban population here.
Then when I first tried it and had this very pleasant, secure feeling experience, I thought, well, this doesn't seem like a dangerous drug. What if it's all hype?
But heroin didn't remain a harmless high.
I mean, I had friends tell me after I quit heroin, oh, well, I'm very glad you quit because it was getting to be almost impossible to have a conversation with you, and I don't think I would have been friends with you much longer.
There's a group out there, that what I call the in-closet heroin addicts, that are actually doing heroin while working, and what I call them the desperate functional addicts.
Desperate because, unlike Marlowe, who says she was able to quit on her own, once they're on, most heroin users say they can't get off, at least not without the agony of withdrawal.
You just feel so horrible. You feel like you have a bad case of the flu, and you might have convulsions, but you know that one snort or shot of heroin will cure you. That's why it's almost impossible to detoxify on your own.
Is it life-threatening withdrawal?
Yes, it can be. We used to think that it was not necessarily life-threatening, that it was emotionally and physically painful, but not life-threatening. Now we know that's not true. It can be life-threatening, particularly in the presence of other chronic medical problems.
The power of addiction, the pain of detox, just two of the threats that are posed by drugs. Then there are the criminal consequences, which can be severe. Even marijuana remains illegal in this state and around the country. In 1997, the last year for which national stats were available, there were a record 700,000 arrests, Raymond, for marijuana use alone.
So, do we make drug enforcement tougher, or should we be going the other way? Brendan Byrne reveals his perhaps surprising prescription just 1 minute from now, so stay with us.
I think it's ludicrous. It has been known throughout the century that heroin, cocaine, all that stuff has destroyed lives. Why would you want to legalize drugs?
Maybe it cuts down on violence. Maybe you don't have people gunning each other down the streets over drugs, and maybe they're not selling them on the corner anymore. Maybe you're going to a pharmacy and you're paying for it.
It's wrong. It's killing people, and it will increase crime as it is.
Drugs is not good for anyone. I wouldn't legalize drugs.
I think what happened during the Prohibition era. Granted, it's a trial, and I think it should be placed on trial.
Definitely not. I think too many people in society are out of control now, and that would just almost it would make it even worse.
If people want drugs, they're going to get them, so they might as well have the government making the profit, not drug dealers.
Legalize drugs? Still a radical notion, but Brendan Byrne's no radical, or is he? Governor, welcome to Due Process.
Nice to be here.
Good to have you. I understand that you think we should be talking about legalizing heroin.
Well, let me start with this proposition. I'm against drugs, and I think drugs are bad. I think they're evil. We ought not have them around. What we really have to do is pass that issue and face the issue about what do you do with drugs. And you've been familiar with all of the statistics about how many people are in jail, about how the drug enforcement policies are clearly profile, and then the question becomes, what do we do? Do we keep spending all of this money? Do we keep tolerating politicians whose only solution to the drug problem is to increase the penalties and make the sentences mandatory? Or do we take a more realistic look at drugs? You know, I started as a prosecutor, and one of the things I had to enforce was gambling laws. And yet they're not enforceable. They were not enforceable. So what do? I allowed casinos in Atlantic City, and I took away some of the penalties for social gambling, and I think we saved a lot of time and expense in gambling enforcement.
In a new Byrne administration, would gambling be treated the same way heroin, for example? People could have access to it in that same open kind of way?
Well, I got to stop you there, because you're talking about access to it. People have access to heroin. Anybody who wants heroin can get heroin. Let's stop talking about enforcement policies that don't work, and let's start talking about what we really do about the drug problem. And what we really do about the drug problem is to stop putting people in jail and throwing away the key, starting to analyze what you can do about drugs and what you can't do about drugs, and take away. I mean, there's a whole syndicate of people now who not only sell drugs, but who have an interest in keeping drug laws tough, and so there's a whole group of people who run the prisons, who run law enforcement. I mean, there are a huge number of people employed in chasing drug addicts or drug sellers as part of their business. And what we've got to do is stop all of this and start to realize we've got a problem. Here's the way we deal with it. And putting people in jail is not the way. And profiling people is not the way.
Now, one of the reasons your voice has credibility when you talk about this is that you were involved in law enforcement. There's another guy at the table who has some law enforcement credentials. Bob Tartufo, you were the Attorney General of the state, U.S. Attorney, which means on both the federal and the state level, your job was to enforce the laws concerning drugs. If, in fact, we have huge populations of people, large numbers of people who wouldn't be in jail but for drug involvement, what's wrong with Brendan Byrne suggesting we need to talk about decriminalizing and dealing with it from another point of view?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I much enjoyed your talking about the new Byrne administration. I served in the first.
Okay, will you serve in the...
I'd love to serve.
Well, we've got to work out this drug policy first.
If you get us back in office, I would appreciate it. Okay. Thank you, Ray.
But we got to work out drug policy first.
I don't really think that the governor and I are that much are that far apart in terms of how we feel about this particular situation. We have a problem. We've had a problem. We have to try to deal with that problem and try to solve that problem. I don't think that we should be tolerating the masses of people that have been placed in jail over the drug issue. And I think that we need to continue to find solutions. Legalization, however, of heroin is just out of the question, because wherever it has been tried, and it's been tried recently in Switzerland and other places, it's created the same type of situation. More addicts, increased health costs, unborn kids in the womb who, when they're born, have brain damage and other types of disorders, increased family dislocation, more hazards on the job, and a terrible example for kids because there's something there that's legal and it causes them to try to experiment. We have to deal, we have to deal with education of people. We have to deal with treatment of people. And I agree that the politicians who just say, let's throw everybody in jail, that has to be stopped.
Well, suppose, Bob, that we said, no, heroin's not going to be legal. Heroin is going to be a disorderly person's offense, and if we catch you using heroin, you get fined $50 or $100. And so we know now that public policy is against encouraging the use of heroin. But on the other hand, we're not being unrealistic about who uses it and what the consequences are. And you've seen all the statistics. Incidentally, the experience in in Switzerland is open to various reports, and I've seen in Foreign Affairs an article that indicates that it's not nearly as much of a problem as you've described it. So don't take that on
Would you
faith.
reallocate money that is now used for incarceration and enforcement and use it for treatment or other? Would that be part of how you'd view this?
Sure, but even there you need more stuff. I mean, when you see that there's in New York City a courier service that delivers heroin to your door in the most fashionable sections of New York to people who know what heroin is and know what the use of heroin is, you can't just say, well, we've got to have a program to educate people, because those people are educated. They know what to do.
Let me ask you to respond to a criticism that comment is going to precipitate, and that is that as long as heroin was confined largely to inner cities and to the poor, then our response was law enforcement and draconian. And once it becomes more apparent that heroin use has moved into the suburbs, to areas of greater affluence, now we're more open to being more flexible. How would you respond to that criticism, which is going to be an inevitable response, among others, to this suggestion?
It may be, and I have always had the view that heroin enforcement and drug enforcement is basically a profiling problem. It's not been, somebody who's a celebrity who gets caught with heroin, you read a few days later that something's happened, the charge has been dropped. There's never one of these things where, oh, we found the ex-baseball player on heroin and we're having an investigation as to where he buys it and where we can crack down on it in this hotel room. Well, no, you don't do that. And so, yes, it's always been a racial issue, in my opinion.
Now, to the extent that we begin to reorient this, and we take, for example, your disorderly person's offense, which would be held in municipal court, would that also be applied to somebody who sold it, who distributed it?
Well, I don't know. I think you have to look at a policy, and distribution of heroin is a profitable enterprise, and if he were distributing candy bars and not paying tax on the money he was making, you would crack down on him for that. So I think there has to be a policy where we do that. But ultimately, we've got to take the profit out of the whole heroin traffic.
That's always been the argument of people who have said we've got to treat the drug policy differently. That is, as long as you make the cost of drugs high by this enforcement mechanism, which makes it more risky and dangerous, that you keep the profit in it. And when you take all of that out, the pharmacological, the actual chemical value of this stuff is not so great.
Well, I think you have to have a multifaceted type of policy. I think there is a place for very vigorous enforcement, and that is on large-scale rings, where distribution rings, where there is an enormous amount of profit involved. And I think law enforcement...
But can I interrupt you? Because what I know from having represented people who are small guys and big guys is that you get the small guy and you squeeze him till he hollers, and that's the way you get the big guy. So effectively, pressure at all levels has been the traditional law enforcement strategy.
I understand that, but the small guy, and this is why the sale part of this is difficult, the small guy is usually a user who may be selling stuff to feed his own habit. So it's not that clear. There's some ambiguity there, and that really needs to be... But we need to develop a policy that takes that into account. But my policy would be to keep the pressure on the large organizations. And I think the federal government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, working with state governments, but taking the lead can be effective in those areas.
One thing
excuse me, I just...
He's the governor, you're just the Attorney General. You can't talk over
it. And I'm probably not getting in the new Byrne administration now, but...
it's been my guiding light all along.
Education has proved, I know we still have a problem and we have to deal with it, but education has proved very successful. We have to keep that education complement going. Ann Marlowe on your show said that she thought she could take a little and it wasn't going to bother her, but heroin is all compelling. It takes over the body and the soul, and we have to tell people about those things.
You were one of the most popular governors ever in the state. It's true, and it's essential that we...
20 years
that's
after.
The bill. No, well, you were popular then. Well, they used to have an arena, but then here's the point. If, in fact, you were to run for office with all your popularity, and this were one of the positions that you took, even with the support of people like Bob Del Tufo with his law enforcement credentials, it would be a tough sell. And among your bitterest enemies on this issue would be fellow Democrats in the legislature who would at least publicly say, this is crazy. What do you do to get the debate to a point where you can reasonably discuss alternatives like these, which, while you discuss them here, are not really being aggressively pursued in the Congress or legislature?
While I was governor, we had bills introduced for the legalization of marijuana for medical purposes. This was a long time ago, and I indicated support for those bills. They didn't move in the legislature, but I indicated support, and there was no great editorial bombast against that.
But do you think this debate, let's assume you get elected, you're governor, Bob Del Tufo's at your side, do you think the legislature would respond, or the editorial writers around the state, in a way that would at least get an intelligent discussion going, as opposed to the knee-jerk response, more jails, we don't care that 70% of people in jail in Essex County are there for drug-related offenses?
I think most of the editorial writers today appreciate the fact that the present policies are not working. We're not really stopping anybody. We're crowding the jails with people who really don't belong there.
So much for the fourth estate. What about the legislature? Could you get, and I think, replace this whole legislature with a whole bunch of people?
Let me tell you.
Go ahead.
I had the experience of educating legislators on the need for a state income tax. That's even tougher than drugs. And they eventually
Can you
saw...
name 5 other publicly elected officials in the state of New Jersey who you think are willing to talk intelligently, they don't have to agree with you on all 4s, about maybe looking at decriminalizing some aspects of our drug policy, reallocating our resources?
Let's take other legislatures in other states, and they've certainly gone for the medical use of marijuana. And so that they're not being thrown. As a matter of fact, the public opinion...
May I comment on this?
Sure, go ahead.
Excuse me. I think you get to the public, and I don't think the public likes what they see out there. They see a problem. They see the jails crowded. They see public money being spent. I think you get the public, then you'll get the legislature. And I think if you present the public with a program of reallocation of money for education, for treatment, for trying to deal with the problem in an intelligent way, that legislatures will follow that. And I think that it's doable, and I think we ought to be putting our efforts there.
Suppose the governor said our pedagogical tool is a massive education program about not using drugs, coupled with decriminalizing marijuana as a starting point to get people to rethink that issue. Would that be something you'd support?
Well, I certainly think marijuana ought to be available for medicinal purposes. Decriminalization, I'd have to think further about it. Certainly not as serious a drug as heroin, but we don't want to convey the wrong impression to, especially to our kids.
But isn't part of the problem that we're kind of schizophrenic on it? On the one hand, we have drug courts. We do make efforts in New Jersey to try to be somewhat more enlightened. On the other hand, we continue to have draconian penalties that have racial and class implications.
Well, you're talking about penalties now. I think.
But that reflects a certain difference in the debate.
I think legal and illegal, criminal and non-criminal, I think those are important distinctions. And sometimes in order to get people to submit to treatment, we have very good treatment facilities, Integrity, Daytop, Cure.
But not nearly enough.
Renaissance House.
Not nearly enough.
Right. That's why we have to reallocate our money. And if we reallocate our money, too, to kids programs, to juveniles, which we have never done in this state, which we must do, I think that we would have successful results.
And you're starting to see, politically, you're starting to see in New York a revolt against the so-called Rockefeller drug laws. There's more and more support building
Even
up.
Governor Pataki, a little bit of movement, but the bottom line is that here in New Jersey, even though you two know more about politics in New Jersey than any other 2 people who are not in the moment in elective office, there are not a lot of names that you've been able to throw out of people who've shown an enlightened view, who are in elective office now, who are willing to move.
But I think with a little leadership, you could get that kind of support. You got to do it one step at a time.
What's the first step?
The first step is to recognize marijuana as a less dangerous drug than it's being portrayed by those people who go before the electorate now. And then I think the next step would be to modify the classification of heroin and cocaine as serious drugs and make that a disorderly persons offense, so that you're not putting people in jail forever. The man who invented the transistor radio was in jail for 10 years because they caught him with some heroin one time. It's ridiculous.
So it sounds... Go ahead, Bob.
Oh, I'm sorry. Whatever you call it, a disorderly persons offense, or you have pretrial intervention, or you do something, you have to deal with those those crimes in a different
Well,
fashion.
it sounds like the only hope for a change here in New Jersey is a new Byrne administration.
No, not at all.
Or somebody else who's willing to, because right now nobody who's elected is willing to do it.
First of all, the fact that you got a program like this where people are going to listen and they're going to say, hey, maybe we ought to have more intelligent discussions.
I got to bring you back to talk more and bring some elected officials in this time, because that's it for this edition of Due Process. We hope you're going to join us again next week, because we're going to return with another cutting-edge issue of law and social justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown.
What upset me most about my evolution towards addiction was the disappearance of heroin-free places and times from my life. One by one, I violated the taboos. I got high before meeting lovers, in the bedroom before undressing for a one-night stand, before a family dinner. I took dope out to my beach house, to a camping trip in the desert. I got high before going running, and I got high after I'd already gained my runner's high. I got high first thing in the morning. This was the worst, because as soon as you got high, it felt like you disappeared the whole day. The opposite of stopping time.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,